Let's take you back now to one of our leading stories. The Police Minister Senzo Mchunu has outlined his department's plans to fight the rising extortion cases. He says laws will be reviewed in a bid to bolster crime-fighting efforts. For more on this, we speak now to the University of KwaZulu-Natal's Department of Criminology and Forensic Studies, Professor Nirmala Gopa. Prof, good evening to you. We talk again after having spoken some 2 weeks ago in that province of KwaZulu-Natal, and the subject matter is no different. Crime, the levels of crime in the country, and incidentally, we are also reporting today about yet more suspects that have been gunned down by police in KZN. What do you make of the police minister's stance in Parliament today, saying that there's a plan to fight crime and in particular the trend of extortion?
Good evening, Collie, and good evening to your listeners. Of course, I think that's really a welcome idea. I also believe that the new minister, of course, seems to, speak. He's saying the kinds of things that I think the citizens of South Africa want to hear. We all know by now, and I'm sure in our little circles, etc., in our communities, etc., we probably have experienced or heard of these extortion rackets that are going around. So I think that's the kind of information or the ideas that communities want to hear, specifically that the minister has put in or has tailored a strategy to begin to combat this type of crime in particular.
Yeah. Professor, the pronouncements by the Minister of Police, they remain only just that, pronouncements. But if you go back to what I mentioned earlier, which is yet another incident in KZN where police have gunned down, I think, 6 suspects today. There are those in the Eastern Cape who are saying, please borrow us the services of Lieutenant General Nhlantla Mkhwanazi in KwaZulu-Natal, because clearly in the Eastern Cape we are sorely lacking in police leadership. Could you borrow him to us so that he comes and deals with these matters here? That tells you the desperation of the people when it comes to crime in the country. What do you think the general in KZN, Nhlantla Mkhwanazi, is doing right? Again, I think we're revisiting that conversation. Is he the man here that is going to put an end to these crimes, or are socio-economic issues perhaps the determinant here as to whether or not violent crime is going to go down in the country?
So, Toli, very interestingly, I think there are many conversations on the ground that are happening within this context of the Eastern Cape wanting to borrow the commissioner for, the KwaZulu-Natal commissioner. And the conversations on the ground at this point in time, and the ones that I've been privy to, is perhaps that's what the Eastern Cape requires. And I think the reason, one school of thought for that is, like you mentioned, it's desperation. And those who are desperate, citizens of the country who are tired of the high levels of crime, the high levels of violence, the inability for them to protect themselves, and the lack of effectiveness in terms of some of the province's police officers to protect them, makes them more desperate. And I think they get to the point where they make these kinds of statements, like, let us borrow the commissioner, the provincial commissioner of KwaZulu-Natal, because he seems to be doing what we all want. But of course, having said that, I think there probably is a lack of awareness in terms of the rights of all people, which we discussed 2 weeks ago, and the fact that even criminals or the accused have rights. And I think that kind of ignorance, perhaps, or so-called ignorance, is what brings about these kind of expressions, like let us borrow the provincial commissioner from KwaZulu-Natal, because it's almost like the shoot to kill, a slogan that we encountered in the country previously. From, of course, a scientific point of view, we don't, I would not in any way condone violence. Violence begets violence. So I wouldn't condone that. I don't necessarily believe that the strategy or the modus operandi of the provincial commissioner is the right one. And it also, I think, to some level or some degree, begs the question, why are we resorting to violence? What should we be doing in terms of being proactive to combat crime before it escalates to this violent level where we now where police seem to have lost the battle, and the only way in which they can gain some kind of credibility is to meter out this kind of violence. And I think that for me would be a concern.
Yeah. On that very score, Professor, of why have we resorted to violence, and for police to gain any sort of credibility, perhaps they ought to meet violence with violence. I'd like for you to just listen to the words of the Police Minister today in Parliament, talking directly to the issue of extortion and perhaps his description of these elements. And I want to quote him directly here. He says, most of them, extortionists, are individuals who do not want to work, but rather choose to parade as armies of murderous parasites that must be fought and rejected by society as a whole. Is that the voice of a police minister who says, I'm sick and tired, and if I'm going to gain any credibility, as you say, let's meet violence with violence?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that the minister had, made those claims. And again, I go back to the whole notion of what are we lacking as a country? If there are no jobs, and I just wonder why the minister would say these are people who don't want to engage in meaningful, legitimate work. But in the absence of those opportunities, what do people do? I'm not in any way condoning the behavior of the extortionists, but what I'm alluding to is, do we as a country have adequate job opportunities so that every person who is at an age who should be meaningfully employed has an opportunity to be meaningfully employed? And I think unless we start looking at it, and I said this previously as well, we start looking at it in an integrated way, I don't think we're going to win this battle against criminals and crimes that we find, the high levels that we find in our country. The creation of jobs is so central in terms of serving as a deterrent or reducing crime in South Africa. Unless we get those institutions correct, and unless we get the balance, the battle against crime and criminality in South Africa is going to be an extremely difficult and tough one to challenge.
Let's touch a bit on what the minister said are plans to try and deal with the scourge of criminality in the country. He says, and I quote him directly here, we have initiated the signing of cooperative agreements with provincial and local governments with operational plans seeking to integrate our resources against crime. But here's a retort from the EFF's Member of Parliament, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, who says, you are going to work with provinces and signing agreements. That has been done before. You're going to work with CPFs and security companies. That has been done before. Therefore, according to Ndlozi, there is no comprehensive crime prevention strategy here. He says until that happens, you're always going to run after the fact. Is the Member of Parliament Ndlozi correct?
I think those are very interesting views, really. I mean, the EFF's response to the minister's speech in Parliament today. I think a very interesting response, because from where I sit as well, I think policies, strategies, etc., are as good as its implementers. And if history has taught us that none of these strategies, etc., has been as effective as they have intended to be, then are we duplicating effort that will, prove to be futile in the future as well? I think for me, what is very critical is to find out what were the policies, the strategies, etc., we've had previously. What have been the successes of some of those? What have been the weaknesses? And then look at the weaknesses or the gaps and find out what do we need to fill this. And I think in trying to do so, that would be more meaningful in terms of our attempts to combat or reduce crime in South Africa, but not more of the same.
Yeah. The police minister, although perhaps I haven't caught sight of the actual document that he is going to base this on, but he's talking about changing the Criminal Procedure Act. And that amendment perhaps will talk to some of these finer details of the changing of the laws. But one of the things he seems to be mentioning more and more is that perhaps people who get arrested and get convicted of crimes, they simply cannot be seen to be living a lifestyle that is better than a person who lives in an informal dwelling, in a shack, if you want to put it crudely. And therefore, those people who are sitting in jail can't have a nice time whilst having left families who do not have breadwinners on the other end. Is that perhaps what could possibly be part of the solution here, that criminals must feel that prisons are not safe havens for them?
Tolly, I don't know how easy it's going to be to implement that kind of idea or notion. I mean, we know our prisons have been seen as, for example, in some instances, we even call them universities. In other instances, people call them hotels. So they are comfort zones in various ways. How the minister is actually going to implement that, for me, is quite a puzzle at this point in time. But in addition to that, I think unless we start working in a way that, we have corrupt officials, we have corrupt community members, etc. And unless we start to deal with those levels of corruption, I think it's going to be so difficult to ensure that criminals start to live a life, for example, that's lesser than someone who lives in a poverty-stricken environment. So for me, it sounds like rhetoric at this point in time, but I'd love to give it a chance.